Orwig. David is a scientist at the Harvard Forest, which is a forest out in Petersham, Mass. And this is a long-term ecological research site, which basically means, in addition to being part of Harvard, is also part of the NSF sort of research network. And there's just amazing research going out there. They have whole armies of undergrads who work there in the summer. So if you're looking to get involved in research over the summer, I encourage you to sort of look at their research opportunities. David is a forest ecologist and has done some really wonderful work looking at sort of not only what happens locally in terms of how invasive species are changing our forests, how landscape features influence our forest structure, but taking a much more regional view of our forests. And so I'm really glad he took up us on our offer, and I'm looking forward to looking at to your seminar. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm not really used to having this stuck in my ear, but I'll do my best as I go on here. So I want to thank Colin and Sarah for having me come today, especially, and I appreciate all the turnout today on a rainy day, although it's not as rainy here as it was out in central Massachusetts, where I'm from. And as Colin mentioned, I'm a forest ecologist. I've done a lot of work with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, and I do a lot of talks on that, and I wanted to do something a little bit different today and share with you some information on a project that I've been spending many years on, actually, and we just completed the data collection. So it's an opportunity for me to share some of that information. It's not really a final product per se, but it's a work in progress, but it's getting pretty close. And so the timing was right to share some of that with you. I will also be discussing a little bit about Harvard Forest, as Colin mentioned. And before I start, I also want to acknowledge a person, Jay Aylward, who's done a lot of this work with me, and so I want to acknowledge him up front. I will begin by, how many here are undergrads? Yeah, a lot of you. So I thought that might be the case. So I'm going to go over some opportunities that exist at Harvard Forest that Colin briefly mentioned, and as well as giving you a little bit of history of Harvard Forest. Has anyone been to Harvard Forest? Couple. Okay. So I'll give you a little bit of background with that, and then get into this large plot activity that I've been involved with the last couple of years, show you what the plot looks like, and then share with you some of this new information that's come from the plot, and then maybe finish with some last steps. So Harvard Forest it's an older institution. It was actually established in 1907. It was part of Harvard University. It still is. We consider our outdoor laboratory. It was also a forestry school at the time. Most Ivy League schools had forestry programs early on. And so it's contained within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, as well as the graduate school. So this was the original director's house, set up in 1907. Dr. Fisher started this. He was also worked a lot for the state. That's been renovated, and that's where students stay over the summer now, and visiting groups as well. And our main building here is Shaler Hall. And housed within Shaler Hall, we also have a really nice museum, which contains some of these amazing dioramas, which are handmade models in the 1930s with individual trees. Some have thousands of trees in them. They're very realistic, and they depict a lot of the land use history in New England. And throughout all this, the mission over the years has changed a little bit, but basically it's to develop and implement interdisciplinary research and educational programs so we can investigate the various factors that influence our landscape and our earth. It's now up to about 3,700 acres that we have in Petersham. We have several different properties. This is our main property of Prospect Hill. This is where our buildings exist. We have other pieces of land that we use for experiments in other parts of the town of Petersham as well. And so it contains a variety of different infrastructure, both in terms of buildings like laboratories and greenhouses, but a tremendous amount of field infrastructure, including weirs for our hydrological investigations, walk-up towers that we can go up above the tree crowns, and also eddy flux towers, which can measure the fluxes of CO2 and water multiple times a second, so that we can look at whether the trees are storing or releasing more carbon over time. Colin also mentioned it's basically a long-term ecological research site. A lot of our funding comes from the National Science Foundation in what's called a long-term ecological research project. And so over the years, we've established many long-term field experiments, meaning they'll last maybe 6, 10, 18 years. And so that gives us a unique perspective to try to answer questions related to climate change or land use history or you name it. And so I thought I'd highlight a few of them here today. One of our oldest running experiments is a soil warming experiment. Through underground heating cables, we can heat the ground and the soil 5 degrees above sea, and we can follow what happens in terms of carbon flux over time. And we also have a much larger one. These are 5 by 5 meter blocks, but we also have a large 30 by 30 meter block that we've also heated. Just incidentally, the reason this is a really nice study, but it has limitations, is these roots are probably going to go over here into a control plot or into a heated control. The 30 by 30 meter plot allows us to look at many of the trees, and we can confine that heating element to just those trees versus them going into another plot. So these are costly studies, but they've been quite informative over the years. We also have pulled trees down in a simulated hurricane. That's a long-going study now, maybe 20 years we've been following the revegetation process that occurs out there. And a variety of other studies here, from nitrogen saturation in terms of applying high amounts of nitrogen on the soil. What happens when that occurs? If we have nitrogen deposition, that's getting better over time, but certainly it's still an issue, and then we've been able to investigate that. We have 3 eddy flux towers, soil respiration studies. There's a big group that's looking at invasive pests and pathogens. I've done a little bit of that work as well. Land use history has been a big one in Harvard Forest. Again, since 1907 it has existed, and so we have this really detailed archive as well. And so land use history has always been a big component of Harvard Forest research. Looking at a longer term history of New England and the region, there's a lot of paleo ecological research. So looking at sediments found within small lakes or ponds or bogs to look at long-term changes in vegetation over time in terms of more of almost like a glacial cycle. And so we have the ability to look back in time, and we can also we're starting to have a big influence on looking forward. So we have a big group looking at future scenarios. So taking and asking stakeholders what type of forest you think, or what type of energy or biomass future do you think will exist in this state, and then we can run models to see, well, what influence will that have on our forest. So that's a new thrust of our research, looking at future scenarios. And of course, a lot of the studies have long-term plots. And so one of the plots I'm going to talk about today is a much larger plot. And not to forget our wildlife species, we have quite a few people looking at various wildlife studies. And so we have a big study that's looking at moose and deer browse. This is actually at Harvard Forest. We have these game cameras up, and we have ways to keep out moose in some and deer in others, because moose we feel are growing in populations in this state. And so we can use some of these types of longer term plots to see what influence moose would have versus as compared to deer. All right, so in terms of undergraduate opportunities, one of the really exciting times is over the summer. We have an REU, which is called Research Experience for Undergraduates program at the Forest, and every year we have usually between 20 and 30, sometimes 33 students come from all over the country to work with us on various projects. And so as an undergrad, you either be working one-on-one with a mentor, or maybe with a group of students, 2 to 3 or sometimes 5 students together on a variety of topic areas, from wildlife dynamics, computer science solutions for big data. That's a new thrust. We have a lot of group projects and a lot of students working on big data. One of the changes in ecology is looking at these big networks and large amounts of data. And so we've, last couple of years, have had students work on those types of issues as well. Because of the eddy flux towers, some students work on the atmosphere-biosphere exchanges. I mentioned the paleoecology, conservation management, things like wood owner survey, things of that nature. We have a variety of global change experiments too. We have one that blows hot air around. It's called, there's a hot plants and warm ants or something like that. It's designed to look at invertebrates and what influence the warmer air potentially in the future will have on their either population levels or movement. And of course, biodiversity studies as well. So this program is an 11-week program. It runs from May to August. Pretty good pay for the summer for 11 weeks. Excellent housing and a meal plan, including travel costs as well. So a lot of this is contained in our website, harvardforest.fas.harvard.edu. Usually it's in February that we have applications due. We'll have a list of projects for the upcoming year, probably in November this year. So you can look at those projects, see if any of those interest you. It's a competitive program. It's a really nice opportunity. And I close this part with saying sometimes there are other opportunities with faculty. You know, Colin has had students come out to Harvard Forest. Elizabeth Crone has students that have done work at Harvard Forest. So sometimes maybe we'll be reaching out to different faculty, either at Harvard Forest or here, if there's any type of synergies there. There might be some other ways to get some research activity there. All right. Any questions on the summer program? It's a really neat program. So I'll segue into this large plot network. There is this network globally now of large plots. What do I mean by large plots? Usually at least 25 hectares in size that were designed initially for tropical areas that had really high species richness, sometimes over 1,000 species in a large plot. And so they needed that kind of large size to answer some of those questions related to what, first of all, what was there, what type of spatial associations do they have. And so that initial tropical network has grown now to include temperate forests, both in North America and across to Asia and elsewhere. And so now there's 59 plots in over 20 countries, 5.5 million trees that are being monitored, and you know, countless number of species, 9,000 species I think it's up to now. And the unifying methodologies, all sites are sampled the same way. We sample all woody stems down to 1 centimeter DBH. And the idea is that you'll recensus those plots every 5 years. So this provides a tremendous large data set to start answering some large questions about how forests are changing, what influences forests in different countries, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really nice network to be a part of. Just as a brief background, you know, back in 2003, we actually hosted a 10-day data analysis for the Center for Tropical Forest Science, and that got us thinking about, oh, it'd be neat if we had a big plot at Harvard Forest. And then in 2007, we had initial talks with Stuart Davies, who at the time was at the Harvard University Herbaria, and also with CTFS. And so we began in earnest trying to plan for perhaps putting in a big plot at Harvard Forest. And then so in the following year, we formed a science team to figure out where we're going to put it, how big we want it. Let's make sure that it's the same as what the rest of the plots were in terms of size and things like that. And then by 2010, we actually received the funding and began the establishment and census. So here we are in 2014. We just finished it in March of 2014. It took a long time to do the initial census, and I'll tell you why. It normally wouldn't have taken that long, but we ran into some issues over the time there. So the overarching question that I'll share with you behind this little green thing up here is that how do forests change in the face of a changing climate and with introductions of pests and pathogens? Of course, that's a really broad question, and you can't really answer it after one census. But if you do repeated censuses, you can start to answer some of these questions. And in addition to that question, we have some other more site-related questions in terms of how does past land use history influence the process that we see out there in terms of species composition and structure or ecosystem functions. We have these eddy flux towers. How do they change the hydrological regimes in the forest? And because some of the big plot contains some wetlands, we can start looking at whether wetlands versus forests and how do they change some of the structure and function in these forests. So these are kind of the overall driving questions that will only really be answered in the long term. But we've started it now, and we hope to do it as long as we possibly can every 5 years. So this is basically the overview of our plot here at the Prospect Hill Tract on Harvard Forest. It's 500 by 700 meters. These little notches here was a little grid that was already in place at Prospect Hill that was established in 1980. We were able to then utilize this and then have a survey crew put in plots every 20 by 20 meters. And so that forms the heart of this plot. And so there's 25 rows and 35 columns, essentially. That's how we can think about this forest plot. And, you know, when I'm doing studies in old growth forests or in hemlock forests, I usually like to use plots maybe 20 by 20 meters in size. That's a nice size to look at, 400 square meters. Well, this has 875 of those 20 by 20 meter plots. And so it's a huge amount of work. And this does show some of the infrastructure. There's a hemlock eddy flux tower and a walk-up tower. There's what's called the NEON walk-up tower, the National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a continental scale platform where they look at 20 different locations. They set up eddy flux towers, soil arrays. They look at mammal traps and disease vectors and things like that. And so for the Northeast, Harvard Forest is the location for the neon tower. And the longest running eddy flux tower in the world is the EMS tower set up here, and that's over 20 years now. And so that's also within the plot. So we're able to kind of build off on this infrastructure that's already there to hopefully answer even more interesting questions down the road. So this is the obligatory, Google view from above, but I like to use it because it does highlight a few things that we'll see in some of the maps that I show. First of all, this is leaf-off imagery, so you have an evergreen component here, and then some hardwood components mixed throughout. This is this large interior wetland swamp that became kind of the bane of our study, because I'll show you why. There's just so many stems there. I don't normally sample things down to 1 centimeter, but that's a large proponent of this plot. A large amount of stems are 1 to 5 centimeters. You also see some remnants from some past land use history. We have a few plantations that were planted in the 20s and 30s when Harvard Forest was more of a silvicultural center, or learning the best sites to grow which species. And so we do have a few remnants of those. This, which I call the little cutout, was an area that had actually been tilled or cultivated in the past. There's an old farm site nearby here, and then it had been subsequently cut. So this is our youngest port area of the plot, and you'll see in these species maps, it's quite a bit different. We do have roads that we can see coming out to these various towers and things of that nature. They're rarely used dirt roads, but they do exist within the plot. So because, again, Harvard Forest has been around for so many odd years, we've done a lot of different studies on this tract of land. And so we have some pretty good idea of the land use history, at least broadly speaking. And so this is a paper by Glenn Motzkin back in the late 90s looking at land use history in terms of whether the forest or the area that we're looking at out there was pasture land, whether it was woodlot, or whether it was cultivated. And that was done by looking at soil pits and a variety of historical records, again, that existed in the archive. And so maybe 2/3 of the plot represent what's called woodlot. So this is an area that did experience some selective cutting over the years, but was never cleared, was never pastured, never plowed. And we have the other big land use component here is what's called unimproved pasture. So we think that there probably was used as a pasture, but not intensively, because the soil profile didn't really show tremendous change. And we have a few areas here that was cultivated, what I call that little cutout. So that's some broad background in terms of land use history and how that may influence species composition. We had a rough idea of overall species composition just on some vegetation typing that had been done in the past. A lot of this, again, is hemlock or red oak, a little bit of red maple, or these plantations I spoke of before. And then just broadly speaking, we have a little bit of idea of soils. Most of the soils are considered, in terms of at least drainage, well-drained or moderately well-drained, along with some peat associated with this, what we call a beaver swamp. All right, so this is some of the infrastructure. I mentioned the EMS tower on the eastern part of the plot, longest running tower in the world that looks at eddy flux. We have some new walk-up towers that are also present in or near the plot. And that new neon tower is there, that's this. And then we have a new Hemlock eddy flux tower as well. So we have a lot of infrastructure poised to look at changes in the forest. And then we can now couple that with a very large population sample of the forest. All right, so because it took a lot of time and effort, I always like to get in just a little bit of detail, not too much, but it took a team of people to even get this plot established. We had surveyors that we paid to come out and do the installation of every 20 meters. We would be putting in these rebar first, and then these PVC marked plots, so we knew what each of those plots was, and those 875 plots. Just that in and of itself was a huge effort. Fortunately, we have a really good woods crew at Harvard Forest, and they were very helpful. If I had to do this all, I'd still be doing it. And they were able to paint them all, Dremel all the numbers on there, get the rebar cut, and then the surveyors would put it out. And so basically what we work with are these 20 by 20s, and then within that, each quadrant, the 10 by 10 section in there. And then we had CTFS, Center for Tropical Forest Science investigators, come and help us learn how to train students. And there were a variety of undergrads that helped, either recently graduated or undergrads. Over 25 helped us over the 3 years sample this forest. And so, Rick actually has written a book on how to establish this large plot. And so he was extremely helpful in getting us set up, and they've been doing this in various locations around the world. I will point out this is the first tree we measured, and at the end I'll show you the last tree we measured there. Nice hemlock, although now it's really thinning due to woolly Adelgid. So again, this is the heart of where it all comes from, which are these 20 by 20 meter plots. And within each one of these, we got a 10 by 10 subsection. I mention this just because this is how all the data is collected. Basically, every day the students will be working in these 10 by 10 sections. We string rope across to create these diagonal triangles, and then we just walk around and sample and map and tag and measure everything in there. So if you imagine you were standing here, looking out here, and this is what it looks like in the forest. So there's our corner. We start going around in a clockwise manner, and we tag, measure, and tag everything that's in there. And you think you know species till you go out and then try to measure everything that's there, including down to 1 centimeter. It becomes another interesting challenge. So basically what we did to make sure that everyone was measuring at the same height level, we had these standardized sticks, 1.3 meters, because that's what the standardized protocol is. We mark them all with a wax crayon, measure their diameter, someone records the data, and we put on a unique tag. I mean, just stuff like tags, right? So if I asked you, you're going to run this plot, you need to get tags, but you don't know how many species are out there, you don't know how many trees are out there, what are you going to do, right? How many do you order? So it became a challenge, and you got to put wire on things that are under 10 centimeters. What do you use? What's not going to rust? We end up using like thermostat wire, 8 strands, so you can splice, and then because it's copper coated and it's plastic coated copper, so that worked out very well. So after some of the logistical constraints are worked out, then we tag them all, paint them. We paint them all because we want to go back and measure at the same location the next time. Sometimes we have to change the point of measure based on, you know, if there's a branch there or it's not if we can't get it at 1.3 meters, we'll do it at a different height. But by painting it, we know we're always going to be going back to the same location. You know, fortunately, we had some really nice data sheets that they helped us create because they've been doing it at a bunch of different locations. Then these are the maps. This is the first subquad in the 15th column. So we mark where all the stems are, and this looks like a piece of cake. This is really easy. When there's multiple stems, we circle them, and we put the number on there, keep track of where we are in the plot. But again, this is easy. This is not. So you can imagine doing this. If you look carefully, you can see little yellow paint on every one of these stems that was alive. You also notice snow. You can't do the swamp in the summertime. First of all, you can barely see through this without any leaves. So imagine putting all these with leaves on, just going out 10 meters, you can't see. And so this is what took us so long. We had to spend 3 winters doing this 3 hectare area. We have to do it when there's ice, so you're not falling through, and you're not disrupting the sediment, and so you can get around. Fortunately, we've had pretty good winters. Last year was great for this. It was cold for the workers, but it was really good to get around. And you know, this is the extreme, 262 stems, just in a 10 by 10 section. And so these are all the big clumps that exist out there. Multiple stemmed, either high bush blueberry or Nemopanthus or something like that. So there's a lot that goes into that. All right. So students usually work in crews of 2. And then towards the end of the day, they'd come back. The data was entered daily onto a online server and into a database. And we had different groups, and the data was entered twice. So I initially thought, that's overkill. You know, we can barely get it entered once. But this really is a great way to figure out data entry problems. And you can screen it really easily, and you can make those changes as time goes on. It was a really big learning experience. I'm grateful that we did enter it twice because we caught a lot of errors that way. And then what do we do with the maps? Each map, we just basically scan through a nice copier that produces each one then as a JPEG. And then this is where a lot of the other work came in. We had people come in and just use the ImageJ open source graphing program and then click on each one of these points and add the tag number. So this allowed us to get these XY coordinates for every stem in the plot. And actually, once you get the system up and going, it's a pretty efficient system. Doesn't seem like it when I'm explaining it, but it actually worked out pretty well, especially with experienced people. And then you think that's all done, then you have to screen it all, which I thought was not, I knew it would take some time, but it takes a lot of time. There's so many potential sources of error with the maps. Remember that one map with 262 stems? Well, you know, maybe you did 260 correctly, but you didn't enter the 6-digit tag, you're off by 2 or something. Well, you got to find those errors, and so there are ways of doing it, but it takes a little bit of time. And then, fortunately, once you screen it all, you can then get some really interesting data. In terms of just looking at the various locations in the plot, it's nice to see because we have a lot of variety of forest types within this 35 hectares. You know, the western third is basically hemlock, more mature hemlock forests, or a few white pine in there too. This is one of our oldest forests on Prospect Hill. So some of these trees are over 200 years old. And so it's a really nice place to work. It was really easy to sample. Students really liked working in this area. This was a piece of cake. We had a very large laurel patch right in the northwest corner of the plot. This provided some additional constraints for students to work in, but overall it was pretty good, pretty easy to do. That little, what I call that cutout area, is this area here. It's much younger than the rest of the forest. It's got species that we don't see anywhere else. Things like gray birch, paper birch, and things of that nature are really high in this area. And then a lot of the eastern half or third is oak dominated, much more open oak forest dominated by red oak and red maple. The northeast corner is a more wet, seepy area. It contains some black ash, but mostly hemlock and yellow birch. And then there's a mix throughout of hemlock hardwoods that exist out there. You really get to know a piece of land well, too, when you're going out there every day and seeing what's out there. And then the swamp, of course. There were some easier sections to work in. You know, this is the edge of the swamp, so there was a little bit fewer stems versus this. It became a real challenge. And, you know, you have to really interview people well, saying, well, I know you say you've worked outside before, but have you ever worked in the wintertime when it's 10 degrees and you're there all day? And not many people have done that. But I've had great crews. As long as you're dressed well, it works. But we really had to kind of screen out people who really weren't used to cold weather. It wouldn't work. So we had some surprises. I knew there was poison sumac, but I didn't know how much poison sumac there was in the swamp. And you can get poison sumac in February, I can tell you that, because our crews got it, unfortunately. I always like black gum when they don't have leaves on. They have those little spurs on there. And again, a lot of multiple stems. This is Nemopanthus, I guess it's called Ilex now, the Macronata mountain holly. Here's a 60 stem clump. Well, each one of these gets a tag, even though it's a clump. So that kind of looked like a Christmas tree or trash hanging from the tree when we were done with it. But that way we can go back and see which ones survived, which ones lived, and carry it forward as time goes on. In terms of kind of the rare, or what I call interesting, just because there was so much of the common species, but you know, we had 1 or 2 willow species. We couldn't really ID. They weren't doing well. They only had like 3 buds to go by. They are still alive, so they were right in the middle of the swamp. We had 1 sugar maple. Now, if you go to Harvard Forest, it's ringed with sugar maple out front, and you think, oh, the forest is going to be full of sugar maple, but there was only 1 stem in that entire 35 hectares of sugar maple, 1 elm tree that we found, 1 common juniper, which was upright, which is very interesting. Trembling aspen that we had is now dead. We had 1 dead larch, 2 big-tooth aspen, and then only 1 invasive species, this Rhamnus frangula, and only 2 stems of it. So I was very pleased to see that. Almost really no invasive species out on Prospect Hill in this plot. It'll be interesting to see if that holds true over time. You know, we're lucky in the sense that we had very little topographic relief. You know, basically there is an elevational gradient from the southeast corner to the northwest corner, but less than 30 meters total relief. So in that regard, we were pretty lucky. 1 little steep slope here, but it's not that bad. So in that way, we've been lucky. If you've seen some of these Chinese plots that have really rugged topography and huge rocks everywhere, we fortunately didn't have to deal with that. So some of the results, in terms of the total amount of stems that we tagged, and this includes both live and dead and multiple stems, was 116,000 stems, above 1 centimeter. Now, of those, 108,000 were live, and about 7,500 were dead stems. And just to show you how many were small stems, you know, only 24,000 were live above 10 centimeters. So really a ton were small stems. Average density per hectare, any way you look at it, each column was basically a hectare. So this is our first way to look at the average density. It was about 3,000 stems per hectare. But again, that's down to 1 centimeter. The basal area that we found was pretty high for New England, 42 square meters. And the max DBH was 93 centimeters. And then the total number of woody species was 51 species. And just quickly, just give you the top 10 out of those 50, just because there's some interesting trends in there. We have 25,000 hemlock. And so I'm very intrigued with looking at hemlock woolly adelgid. How many of those are going to survive, let's say even 10 years from now? Holly, I wasn't expecting to be the second most abundant tree, but it ended up being that way because of the swamp. And then comes red maple, a few other shrubs, and then our more upland species, other trees like yellow birch, red oak, and beech. And so the vast majority were in the large trees and the small shrubs. And then basal area is a little bit different trend, just because only 4 species made up 90% of the basal area. So hemlock made up about 36%, red maple 19%, red oak was 23%, and white pine, even though it was 9th, it was 4th in basal area, because that's not surprising. They have some really big stems out there. Again, this is a diameter distribution of the stems of all 116,000. You notice the scale here is in like 10,000 intervals. So if you look at this, it's about 70,000 stems that were 1 to 5 centimeters. So a vast majority of my crew's time was spent looking at small stems out there. It looks like it ends out here at 50, but that's just because of this scale in the tens of thousands. If you look at the tail end of this, you know, there's several hundred that are maybe 60 to, again, 80 centimeters that exist out there. And those are largely red oak, red maple, and a few hemlock and white pine too. Okay, so spatially, if we just look at all species that were tagged, that's where it is. I mean, it's such a nice survey that you can actually see the roads because there's so many stems everywhere else. And it's interesting to look at if you start thinning out. This is everything above 1 centimeter. And if we just look at the 3 most abundant again, we can see that the blue is hemlock in this graph, the green is that winterberry holly, and the red is red maple. Everything else is black. So again, if you look at the level of detail in this figure, every dot, so it's 116,000 stems. And then let's just look at above 20 centimeters. So to really thin out, that cutout area has very few stems in there that are over 20 centimeters. Same with the swamp. And then just for fun, I guess, I looked at where are the trees that are 50 centimeters and greater. And again, they're mostly in this hemlock area and in the oak area over here. We can look at some, I really like this because we spent so many years collecting. It's really nice to then look at the spatial patterns that exist. So I just provide a few of those maps for you here today. This is red maple. There are a few larger dots. Those are the stems that are over 40 centimeters. The vast majority are under 40 centimeters. And they're pretty much grow everywhere throughout the plot, except in this hemlock-dominated area here. We look at red oak, much larger stems. And this is of interest to a lot of people, including the Eddie Flux people, because really the red oak are very large trees. They grow in with red maple, but these are the species that are really dominating the carbon storage at Harvard Forest. They're about 100 years old. They're in their prime. They're really kind of cranking in terms of physiological function right now. Here's the Hemlock Map. So again, 26,000 stems roughly. The large dots here are stems over 50 centimeters. So I'm very intrigued with this. Again, I set up a lot of permanent plots in hemlock forests, never at this scale. And so we can start looking at the spatial pattern of damage and death associated with hemlock woolly adelgid, because we do have it. And 90% of the plots that have hemlock in that large plot has adelgid. And so this is a section right in the middle of that area that is starting to lose trees. And you can see the thinning crowns already here on Prospect Hill associated with more chronic woolly adelgid damage. And it's been in this general region of the plot since 2008. Yeah, so the woolly adelgid is an invasive aphid-like insect that came from Japan in the 1950s on ornamental stock. It has since migrated north within the range of eastern hemlock, and it can basically effectively feed on and kill all sizes and ages of hemlock. It's non-native, so there's really not much resistance. I'm not going to say no, but there's not much resistance to hemlock woolly adelgid. And it feeds, not by chewing needles or anything like that, but the adults will settle at the base of these needles on the underside of the twigs and draw on reserves in the twig itself. So it's more of a chronic infestation. Trees can survive, I'd say 4 to 15 years, depending on how cold it gets in the wintertime. Down south, much less time it'll survive, because they do not get cold winters down south. Any good enough overview?
Yes, when you're getting massive dieback.
Yeah, tremendous dieback. We see a lot of mortality in Connecticut now. That mortality is creeping into Massachusetts, even along the northern tier. And I've seen dead trees in Maine and Vermont now associated with woolly adelgid. So a lot of our old growth forests contain hemlock. The vast majority of our old growth in Massachusetts contain hemlock. I went out to a bunch of them yesterday in the Berkshires. The 4 that we went to all had adelgid, so they are really threatened and will likely disappear in the next 10 years. Okay, I always like this one. The color never works out, but you know, as a kid, I always was interested in both black and yellow birch, and so here's a graph of both these species on here, and they really do kind of grow in different niches, if you will. The yellow birch is in this low-lying area; it's highly concentrated. And the black birch is more on these upland forests. Perhaps to no surprise, but it's interesting to see it within this forest plot. They differentiate quite well. Just a few other ones. Even though I told you there were plantations, sure enough, they show up on the stem maps, these relic plantations of either red pine or Norway spruce that were planted in the 20s, and they still remain there. I like this one just because it really shows this unique distribution. It just hugs the swamp, and again, it's not surprising. This is witch hazel. Tree that's actually flowering right now, and if you go out and look for it, and it does not go in the swamp, it just hugs that swamp quite well. And then just to show you what is the most important ones in the swamp, you know, you got the speckled alder, maleberry or Lyonia, a lot of poison sumac, chokeberry, I don't know if you've heard of that, aronia, and 2 last ones are the holly that we talked about, and arrowwood. So these are species that really are only found in the swamp for the most part, and it shows up quite nicely on that. So, you know, what do we do with all this data? Like I said, some of this data was finalized last week. Some of these figures were finalized last night. And so we're just at the beginning stage of then taking this data and using it in a variety of different ways. This paper just came out in Global Change Biology. It's a tremendous overview of this network. CTFS Forest Geo, that's what these plots are called. And I've never been on a paper before with 108 authors. It's really interesting. I hope we can just use et al. Instead of having to type them all in. And I'm only on there because I'm just the PI of the different plot at Harvard Forest. But Christina Anderson-Teixeira did a really nice job of pulling this all together, kind of getting it out there, like here's this global network, you may have heard of it, but here's what we can do with this type of data. And because ours is now complete, we can compare it now with other temperate or tropical plots, as some other researchers have done. There's some plots in China at the same latitude, so that'll be another interesting comparison with some similar, you know, oak and other pine species as well. It fits in nicely with our long-term work at Harvard Forest, looking at long-term carbon storage on a variety of different plots, both in terms of looking at either different land use history or just in different forest types. So this will provide a much larger data set to compare to some of those other data sets we've collected over time. And then there's any number of studies that can be done with this data. As an example, there's a lot of researchers that are interested in looking at remote sensing through either LIDAR, MODIS, other aerial observation platforms. And then with the data that we have, they can then estimate basal area or height or biomass. So you choose the metric, or at least they can see how well they can estimate it from that type of data. By knowing that there's this data set out there and these frequent flyovers of Harvard Forest. They can then take that imagery and see how well it does at Harvard Forest, and they can maybe estimate it elsewhere based on looking at those images. People are really into looking at phenology now on the PhenoCam network. So some students have started to look at our data set in relation to phenology, which I'll show you here in a minute. And of course, we haven't even started going into some of the whole spatial associations among species, or in terms of how grouped they are and at what scale do they group. That's going to be forthcoming. So just a few applications. Paul Sakara at UMass has tried to start estimating tree height from different aerial imagery and the type of data that we have. And this is just tree height in meters. Of course, that's the swamp, so that's flat. That does a nice job. And so, well, it's a pretty good estimate, at least broadly, probably within a meter or two of tree height. This is a aerial view that was done through an unmanned aerial vehicle that was sent up and flown over the southeast portion of the plot. You can see the swamp section right there. And they were doing it every week in the spring to figure out when trees fully leafed out and when they could consider that tree, you know, end of spring for that tree. And so the blue colors here were early in the spring that they would fully leaf out versus late in the spring into early summer. You see the blue is mostly down here in this section as you get closer towards the swamp. The red colors that were much later in terms of developing. And this makes sense. Cold air drainage, probably much colder, a little bit delayed phenology out there. Another group is interested in looking at remotely sensed images to see, do we see any grouping of species just based on their mycorrhizal associations? So a lot of things I've never thought about when I set up this plot that then people can use this data for. It's really interesting, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other applications that we can do. I'll finish by first thanking the Center for Tropical Forest Science. Researchers are really instrumental in helping us because it's a huge undertaking and it's really hard to do if you haven't done it before. And the people that helped us, including our Woods Crew staff. And then lastly, it's totally impossible to do a study like this without undergrads and recently graduated students. And here's the list of species that we've employed. And again, Jay Aylward helped a lot. And then here was the 116th, 226th stem, the last stem in the plot. You saw that hemlock was the first one. So they finished in March, I think March 14th of this year. So we're done, we're complete. But for all you undergrads that are maybe early on in their career, don't forget 2016. Could be a golden opportunity out there for you to help with the census number 2. And then the students, when they were done with their 20 by 20, they'd mark off by color. And then this winter, they just did the finished when they were done with it, because that was the last 8 plots we had to get done. But I'm hoping this is useful, and then I'm happy to talk more about this or woolly doves or anything afterwards. So thanks.
What's the rationale behind looking at things at the stem level?
Versus, like, multiple stem?
The 60 stem clumps.
Oh.
Why measure all of those?
We were basing it on standardized methodologies. That's my first easy answer. But in certain wetland areas like that, like I'm intrigued with how much the holly turns over. So that's another interesting way to look at. So out of that 60, how many are going to be alive next time? It may be not of germane interest to a lot of people, but that data will then exist so you can start looking at turnover, and maybe it'll grow to even more, 80 clumps or something like that. So that was the rationale. Bottom line is standard methodology. It's a good question, though. Yeah.
Interesting depth data. We get close to Halloween. You mentioned that for hemlock, it seemed to move across all age classes, stem sizes. Have you thought of looking at the other tree species and looking at size-dependent mortality? Is that too fine-grained an approach? It seems like you've got the data.
No, we could do it, certainly over time. Once we get another census or two, we can really start answering that question that much better than you can even through like 30 by 30 meter plots. So we will be able to do something like that. I mentioned my facts on hemlock just from looking at hundreds of stands elsewhere. They really kind of wipe out all size and age classes. But we'll see. We have the data to look at it here. But in terms of other species, it's a good question. Red maple kind of just sits there in the lower level of the canopy. We see some of them not growing much at all. Whether they're going to tail off or not, we don't know. But we should be able to get at that in the subsequent years for sure. Yep. Yep.
Did you guys use any sort of photography, like now that you've done percentage or camera setup?
Yeah, so
Could you?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about that. So the question is whether we use any type of photography to start answering or get at any of the trends that we see in thinning or mortality or anything like that. So associated with these eddy flux towers, we have started to take a series of panoramic hemispherical photographs. We also have light sensors out there. Associated with the towers, we have other sensors that can look at changes in light. And so we think we have a couple different tools to get at the hemlock, but the census itself will be able to get at some of these other patterns of mortality we may not even see till in 5 years from now. So we do have some series of photographs out there. We have the unmanned aerial imagery as well, and we have phenocam imagery. It's taken every half hour on some of the towers that are in the plot. So we have a series of different images that are out there. Yeah, Colin.
So amazing. I was taking a group of bio-51 students in the field a couple years ago. And we're up at the fells, we're noticing the Adelgid, and there was someone just walking by, and we were telling him what we were doing, and he said, what's going to be left in the forest with all these invasive insects? We've got the Adelgids, we've got the emerald ash borer, we've got the longhorn beetle. So what do you expect to see going forward? Are we going to end up with one species that is super species, or what do you, I mean, this is going to be a fantastic resource, because I assume you're not going to try to keep these insects out.
No. So the question is, with all the rise of invasive insects, do we anticipate, well, first of all, can we anticipate what will be left, and are we going to keep insects out? We made a decision years ago to not try to prevent Adelgid from coming through there for multiple reasons. One, we have these eddy flux towers, so it's an unusual opportunity to have 10 years of pre-insect data with all these multiple second fluxes. Then we can then see what happens as they deteriorate, decline, and are replaced. We have good predictions of what we think will happen, but now we have the information in hand to show exactly what happens with hydrology, carbon storage, things of that nature. Hemlock, I think, will be wiped out. That's just my opinion. I think the vast majority of those 26,000 stems are going to be gone in 10 years. Birch will come back really heavily, black birch. And while it does suffer from nectaria, I think black birch is here to stay. Red oak, I don't anticipate ALB getting out everywhere, but hopefully that's hopeful thinking. It's one of the pests I can remain a little bit hopeful about. EAB, unstoppable. Ash is toast. They can't control that one, in my opinion. And there's probably other insects coming, but so I think white pine, birch, red maple, and oak. Those are the four biggies I see that don't seem to be susceptible right now, but of course, we just don't know. It's a good question.
Is that like major leagues or switching to maple bass?
I think there's something true. The question is whether they switch to maple bass, but I think there's some truth to that.
I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about comparing your big data with other big data, because you mentioned that there were some plots that were somewhat similar, at similar latitudes in China, but I'm sure are vast differences among, including species types. So what is it that you're comparing among, or what other data are you looking at, like weather data, like temperature data, et cetera, that enable you to make generalizations that would apply to, Harvard forest in a plot in the Amazon?
It's a good question in terms of what types of data do we collect that we could actually make a comparison with other temperate plots worldwide or even tropical plots worldwide. And certainly most plots now have meteorological data. Very few plots have eddy flux towers, but there's an effort now to try to instrument more plots. Just as a quick aside, and I'm going to keep answering that, most plots when they were originally set up in this network were considered pristine or untouched. We chose a little bit different approach. We said we have all this infrastructure. If we're going to put all this effort in, let's try to get as much bang out of this effort as we can. And so we embraced the infrastructure. We thought we'd utilize it. And of course, now there's a switch for the other plots. Let's try to instrument these plots. And so we're hopefully in the cutting edge of that one. But so you can look at a variety of different things, especially with climate data in different parts of the world. You can see how climate does influence growth, biomass, you name the metric. Ours is going to be one of the few first plots that has a dramatic die-off worldwide. There's going to be other plots that will get it too, though. So that's one type of comparison that can be made. There's a lot of investigation looking at biomass of both small and large stems. The western plots have tons of stems over 100 centimeters. We have none. The southern Appalachians have a handful, at least, measurable numbers over 100 centimeters. We don't have that. We have a shade-tolerant conifer. Not a lot of plots have that in the temperate, but that network is growing. And so there's probably other comparisons I'm not getting into, but you now have the capability of being able to do that. And there are people now that are looking at maybe 14 or 15 plots at once to start looking at the same time period. We're a little bit behind the times in the sense that we only have one census done, but as those censuses are redone, the data becomes more and more powerful to detect longer-term trends. So I think that's really one of the strengths of it. I hope I've answered what you're after. Yeah.
The southern range of hemlock, the replacement species is different than the northeast.
Yes.
Are there any flux towers that can track how the difference of carbon uptake of that replacement species in the south? How that would differ?
Yeah.
Long term?
Yeah, so the question is, are there different replacement species in the south, and are there eddy flux towers in the south to really kind of get at that? I'll answer the second part first. Not to my knowledge, are there eddy flux towers in other hemlock stands in the south. There's certainly other eddy flux towers in the south, but I'm not aware of any that are actually in hemlock forests that are declining very rapidly. In terms of replacement species, in the south, hemlock is much more growing along riparian areas than it is up here. In those areas down south, they have a lot of rhododendron. That's a real big difference from our upland or low-lying hemlocks in New England. Things like tulip poplar could get through some of that if there's a big enough gap. The big question is what will happen with that rhododendron. I think it will actually increase in cover, and so that will really preclude anything else from getting in there. In other places where you don't have the rhododendron, I have seen birch come in the southern Appalachians in other gaps, just like we see here and in even northern parts of New England. For us, as we go into more northern New England, white pine I think will be a big replacement species. In really low-lying areas, even balsam fir could be. I've heard of some places in Maine that are starting to see that. And even red spruce on hillsides where they intermix right now. So birch is the big one, but not the only one, for sure. And then red maple and oak will be important.
One last question.
Sort of a question, kind of like Heisenberg uncertainty. Two questions. One is about identification in the winter. Probably you tree mavens know your stuff so that you can do it mindful. But I was just wondering if you make mistakes. And then the other related question is, in measuring this forest, don't you in some manner destroy it? I mean, you've got hundreds of folks flopping through, measuring tiny straw-like stems. Don't they, doesn't this change the actual study?
Yeah, it's a great question in terms of the question is whether we might in some way impact the forest that we're studying by having all these people out there, and in terms of winter ID. So the winter ID one was challenging, but I was anticipating problems in the winter, and so we started by flagging a bunch of things with leaves on. And then you can get very good at once you're in the swamp, it basically is down to 6 species. So even though they all look the same, they all have subtle, really nice, distinct differences with buds. And like I said, I thought I knew species, so I had to do it in the wintertime with shrubs. I feel much better now about it after teaching other people how to do it. But in terms of are we potentially altering the resource, I would say truly only in the swamp, where there's so many dense stems, did we have the opportunity by accident or otherwise to accidentally break some stems. In the upland forests, you're in there pretty quickly and in and out. And it's usually only 2 people at a time. The swamp was 2 people at a time in smaller areas. So I think so far so good. We have lost stems due to the neon construction. So we have altered it that way, but I think the long-term gain will be nice to have a third eddy flux tower there. It's a good question. We think so far we haven't altered it. It's every 5 years, so we hope that that level of impact won't alter too much, but we won't know until we see. It's a good question. It's a concern.
Let's thank David one more time.
Thanks.
I find it really fascinating to think about. So ecology, for those of you who aren't ecologists, we've done a really different scale. It could be done where you're studying the interactions between a plant and its pollinator, where you can go to a really large scale and do this repeated sampling. So it's really interesting to see ecology push into these really large data sets that are not only challenging to set up, but challenging to sort of analyze once you collect all those data.
Sure.
But it'll be really interesting to see how these different plots are compared over time. So thank you.
Yep. Appreciate it.
Those of you in